I'd also like to take this opportunity to introduce the Environmental Review staff. My name is Colleen Hetzel, and I am the Environmental Review Director. I'm going to pass it to my colleague Sarah for her introduction, and then after introductions, we will begin presentations. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to the discussion at the end.
Hi,
So
I'm Sarah Laryl. And I provide technical assistance. So when you call the main EQB line at 651-757-2873, I'll be taking your call. And on the environmental review line, it's a collaborative process. And so if you have questions on rule interpretation, deadlines, process, just send a note in and we'll collaborate and get back to you right away. We'll go next to Jesse.
Morning, everybody. I'm Jesse Kurzensky with the Environment Review staff here at EQB. I do a lot of assistance in the technical assistance realm with Sarah, and then I also do quite a bit of work with the data collection and data analysis that staff here collect on Environment Review. And with that, I'll hand it off to Kayla.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Kayla Walsh. I am a program administrator here at EQB in our environmental review program as well. And in the past, I've worked on continuous improvement for environmental review and some policy work. And I also serve as our point of contact for tribes. So thank you again for joining us today. Our presentation, like Colleen mentioned, is really focused on the basics of what environmental review or ER is and what it does. We will probably refer to environmental review as ER a lot today and abbreviate it. But I'll kick us off with a short history of environmental review in Minnesota and the basic structure that we have in place. And then Jesse will go into more detail on how to conduct different types of review, timelines, and requirements. So first and foremost, who is the Environmental Quality Board? The board is made up of 9 agency heads and 1 non-voting member, and that's Met Council, and 8 members of the public who apply to join the board and are appointed by the governor. There's one public board member for each of Minnesota's 8 congressional districts. Including our executive director, there are 9 staff that support the board's activities, and the legislature codified the board in 1973 to serve as a forum for leadership and coordination across our state agencies on environmental issues that are interdisciplinary and cross-jurisdictional. As a public-facing board, we do aim to engage with the public and provide meaningful access to conversations about the future of our shared environment. A big part of EQB's charge is also to oversee our Minnesota ER Environmental Review Program. Next slide. So broadly speaking, the board is charged with the responsibility to address issues affecting our water, land, air, and energy and climate. EQB recently updated our strategic plan, and that guides our mission, vision, and values through June 2029. Our mission is to support informed decision-making that protects and enhances Minnesota's environmental quality, and we accomplish that through our values of collaboration, engagement, equity, and trust. The EQB is a coordinating body for the Minnesota Environmental Review Program, so that means that we do control or coordinate the rules. And the Minnesota Environmental Review Program was established over 50 years ago when the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act was enacted, and that took place in 1973. And for shorthand, we call that MEPA. So MEPA received bipartisan support at the time, and it was the first law in Minnesota that really brought the focus of wider environmental concerns down to a programmatic level. And MEPA's purpose is to provide usable information to communities, decision makers, and project proposers on the environmental effects of a proposed project. When MEPA turned 50 years old, EQB worked with journalist Stephanie Hemphill, who wrote an article on how MEPA has played out over the past 50 years. She even interviewed some of the founding authors of MEPA, so I would highly recommend giving that a read for a little bit more context, and you can find it on our website. So next up, on the next slide, we have our legislative guideposts. So Minnesota Statute 116C establishes the board itself, its membership, powers, and duties. Minnesota Statute 116D is MEPA, Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, and that gives EQB the authority to make our environmental review rules, which are Chapter 4410. And those rules are where you will find requirements and procedures for implementing environmental review. Next slide. Today we're focusing on Minnesota, but there is also a federal level of environmental review that's based on the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And NEPA requires environmental review for all major federal actions with the potential to significantly impact the human environment. And I'm sure many of you are aware that right now there are some uncertainties at the federal level on how to implement this. But it's important to note that NEPA itself has not changed, so its core requirements still stand. And Minnesota's ER program is entirely separate from the federal program. So any federal changes do not impact the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act. We are one of 16 states that have a statewide environmental review program, but all of those states are very different. They have different procedures, and comparing them is often apples and oranges. So for one small example, our program applies to both public and private projects, but some states only apply to public projects. So again, in Minnesota, if you do need to file a joint state and federal review when both are required, we have ways of doing that, but our state review policy is not connected to or dependent on the national program. Next slide. All right, so let's dive into the Minnesota ER program under Rule 4410. Next slide. Generally speaking, environmental review is called an information gathering process. So it provides decision makers and the public with the info needed to properly understand a project's interaction with the environment. Environmental review is really meant to inform communities and decision makers and project proposers for a wide variety of projects during their design phase, and it requires public process. When a project is undergoing environmental review, government agencies are not allowed to issue final approvals, and construction cannot begin until the environmental review process is complete. It's important to note also that projects do not pass and they do not fail environmental review. It's not an approval process. And lastly, it does require that any appeals on final decisions for environmental review must be made directly to the Court of Appeals. Next slide. And so with environmental review, there are some inherent benefits to the process, and that's one of those is that it's separate from permitting. So all of the details provided in ER go above and beyond those needed for a permit compliance. And it provides all of that information in one singular document during the project's design phase. And this can lead to more informed decision-making and forethought about the potential impacts on communities and their economies, natural resources, and even cultural resources. So you can think of it as a planning tool that ensures public participation. Next slide. In practice, the EQB would not generally perform an environmental review, but this slide highlights some of our main roles and responsibilities here at EQB. We do develop and maintain the rules, so including those that establish when and if a review is required. We measure and improve the effectiveness of the environmental review program. We provide guidance and technical assistance, and we approve administrative requests like forms, alternative forms of review. And lastly, we publish required notices in our EQB monitor every week. Next slide. And so that's EQB's role, but there are other key players in ER. So the Responsible Governmental Unit, or RGU, implements the environmental review rules by preparing the environmental review documents, making them publicly available, and creating a record of their decisions. RGUs could be state, local, or special units of government. And there are times where EQB assigns the RGU, but there are also times when the rules dictate who the RGU needs to be. Project proposers provide details on their project to the RGU so that they can be informed and complete the review in a good amount of time. Members of the public consider information that's been provided in the review. They can provide public comment, attend public meetings, and if needed, request missing information about potential environmental effects in the project. All right, so next slide. All of those rules are also very well defined in our Rule 4410. This is also where we go to find the purpose and objectives of environmental review, our definitions for terms that we use often. There is a large section that will tell you if a certain type of project requires a review or not. Another section that tells you if a project might be exempt. So for example, if a project has already received all of its governmental approvals or permits, then review would be exempt. Or there could be a specific size or type of project that would be exempt. Rules also describe types of review, procedures, and the criteria that an RGU has to use if they're deciding if a project has or may have the potential for significant environmental effects. And that's what we refer to as decision criteria. Next slide. And these are some examples of those types of projects that would typically do or undergo an environmental review. So you can see it is very wide-ranging, from agriculture to land use to residential, transportation, and waste management. The rules really outline these certain categories of projects to undergo environmental review, and those categories are referred to as mandatory environmental review categories. Projects have to complete review if they are of a type listed in the mandatory category rules, and if they meet or exceed the thresholds set out. Each threshold is specific to a project type. So for example, feedlots uses a threshold that is the number of animal units, and a land use conversion threshold would be measured in acres. If there's a project that does not meet or exceed a mandatory category threshold, it could still receive a review, and that review would be done in the same way, but we would call it a discretionary review. Any state or local governmental unit with jurisdiction can order a discretionary environmental assessment worksheet when the project may have the potential for significant environmental effects based on the nature or location of that project. Next slide, please. And that environmental assessment worksheet that I just mentioned, that's one of our 3 most common types of environmental review. And Jesse will share more details on these, but high level EAWs are the most frequently completed. In the past few years, about 80% of all reviews are EAWs, and that holds true for 2024. The environmental assessment worksheet is often referred to as the EAW form, and the questions on the form are approved by the board chair. The EAW was made to be a simpler type of review, so once the EAW is complete, the RGU can then determine if the project has the potential for significant environmental effects. If it does, then an EIS is ordered. Members of the public can also petition for the EAW to be completed, and Rule has mandatory categories for EAWs, so if a project meets a category threshold, it would do a mandatory EAW. Next up, we have the EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, and that is more complex than an EAW. It requires scoping and a scoping document because there's not one singular form like the EAW. A lot of the time, it's easiest to use the EAW as that scoping document, especially if it's already been completed. And the EIS is generally a lot more detailed. Unlike the EAW, it requires a review of alternatives to the proposed project, analysis of cumulative potential effects, and analysis of mitigations. The review determines if the info on the EIS is adequate or not adequate. Rule has mandatory categories for EISs as well. And then lastly, the AUAR is used as a planning tool for a well-defined geographic area. Despite it being called an alternative urban area-wide review, it can be used anywhere, not necessarily only in an urban environment. But it's used in place of reviews for very specific project types, and those are residential, commercial, warehousing, and light industrial developments. One prerequisite is that a local unit of government has to have a comprehensive plan before pursuing an AUAR. And unlike the first two types, AUARs expire after 5 years, but they can be updated. In 2024, EQB recorded 47 EAWs, which is lower than average, 1 EIS, and 9 AUARs were completed. Next slide. Members of the public can also request an EAW take place on a project through this formal petition process, like I mentioned. Other requirements for the petition, petitions need to include material evidence of the potential environmental effects and at least 100 signatures. The petition would be submitted to EQB, and then EQB designates the RGU based on process, which is laid out in our rules. And then that RGU would need to decide, based on the petition, whether or not to perform an EAW. And now I will turn it over to Jesse, who will go into more specifics on completing reviews, starting with the Environmental Assessment Worksheet.
Great. Thank you, Kayla, for providing an excellent overview on what environmental review is and what the environmental review program looks like at Minnesota. Now, before I really get started, I want to remind all of the attendees here about the Q&A function at the top of your screen. So if you have any questions at all for staff, please feel free to utilize that function to input your question so we can review it and potentially answer it at the end of our presentation today. So now, after Kayla has given that great overview, I do want to provide a little bit more detail about the different types of environmental review processes we see in our program. And I'm going to start with the EAW process. And I will be giving the most details about the EAW as it is the most common way to engage in environmental review in Minnesota. Now, like Kayla noted previously, the EAW can be mandatory as defined in rule, or it may be due to a discretionary order from an RGU for proposed projects that may have the potential for significant environmental effects. Now, ultimately, the EAW process is intended to disclose if a project does have the potential for significant environmental effects. And so if through the process, an RGU identifies that a project does have the potential for significant environmental effects, it would proceed to ordering an EIS to further evaluate those potential impacts. So really the ultimate goal of an EAW is to decide if an EIS is needed or not. Now, the EAW process is meant to achieve this understanding via assistance from the EAW form. Now, the EAW form was created by EQB and is a 13-page worksheet with 22 categories of questions. The questions on the form provide prompts that, when evaluated based on that specific project, will help determine any potential environmental effects from that proposed project. Now, the form itself was really designed to assist in identifying potential environmental effects from all project types. And given that all projects are not the same, there are likely questions on the form that are more tailored to specific project types than others. So the RGU ultimately has the authority and responsibility to identify what information is to be included in the EAW. It is then the responsibility of that RGU to later assess the information, utilizing the decision criteria to determine whether a project has the potential for significant environmental effects and the need for an EIS. Now, the decision criteria is in rule, and I will show that a bit later in another slide. But before we talk decision criteria, I did want to talk a little bit more about the EAW process as a whole. Now, the EAW process ultimately begins when a project proposer submits a permit application and begins discussions about the proposed project with the RGU. The rules, however, of the EAW process don't really kick in and describe process requirements until the RGU receives a data submittal. Now, as the program is implemented today, in almost all instances, this would be when a project proposer submits a draft EAW to the RGU. Hopefully, the project proposer and RGU have had discussions prior to this point about certain aspects of a project that should be evaluated within the EAW. Now, once that data submittal or draft EAW is provided to an RGU, the rules identify how the process is meant to follow in order to move forward. The rules also provide dates or timelines for which the next steps must be completed. So first, after receiving a data submittal or a draft EAW, the RGU then has 30 days to evaluate the data submittal or the draft EAW for completeness. If the RGU determines the EAW to be incomplete, the process then starts over as the document is returned to the project proposer, and the timeline would then restart once a new draft is submitted to the RGU. However, once an RGU determines that the data submittal or the draft EAW is complete, the RGU then has an additional 30 days to supplement any information within the EAW and prepare it for publication. The RGU is then responsible for publishing the EAW with the EQB and the required parties identified by the EQB in rule. And then this publication of an EAW availability starts a required 30-day public comment period. At the completion of the comment period, the RGU is then responsible for responding to all substantive comments and prepares an EIS needs decision. Now, EQB's role in this process is primarily administrative, as we provide the notices in our EQB monitor for any decisions and required publications throughout the process. However, we do also serve as technical guidance to any ER participants throughout that entire process. So if you as the RGU or a project proposer or a member of the public have any questions that arise during this process, EQB staff is there to assist. Now, when making a decision on the need for an EIS and determining if a project has potential for significant environmental effects, the factors on this slide are to be considered. We have the type, extent, and reversibility of environmental effects, cumulative potential effects, the extent to which the environmental effects are subject to mitigation by ongoing public regulatory authority, and the extent to which environmental effects can be anticipated and controlled as a result of other available environmental studies. And this would be the decision criteria that I mentioned earlier, which is in rule and helps make decisions on the need for EIS and potential for significant environmental effects from proposed projects. So now that I've given a rundown of the EAW, let's talk a little bit about the environmental impact statement or EIS process. Now, similarly to the EAW, a project may result in an EIS in a few ways. An RGU may decide through the EAW process that an EIS is necessary, or a project may be large enough to meet a mandatory EIS category threshold. An EIS is much more in depth than an EAW, and it must include a scoping process, which we typically utilize the EAW form to complete and is key to focus the EIS on essential information and identifying pieces of information that need further analysis through the EIS process. An EIS must include an assessment of project alternatives, as well as a comparison of the environmental, economic, and social impacts of a proposed project and those alternatives. The EIS must include an identification of measures that could reasonably eliminate or minimize any adverse environmental, economic, employment, or sociological effects of that proposed project. Now, an EIS also includes additional process steps when compared to the EAW and required engagement opportunities for the public or other governmental agencies to provide input on the proposed project and any alternatives. The final decision on an EIS is a determination of adequacy. Adequacy means the document addresses the potentially significant issues and alternatives from the scoping process, identified from the scoping process, and it provides responses to all substantive comments received about concerning issues raised in the scoping and followed all the procedures for the EIS process through the draft EIS and the final EIS. And lastly, while an environmental assessment worksheet and an environmental impact statement are designed to look at individual projects, an alternative urban area-wide review, or an AUAR, is designed to look at the potential environmental effects from anticipated projects within a defined geographic area. Now, the AUAR document uses a list of questions that are adapted from the EAW form to tailor to certain development type scenario projects. The AUAR acts as a substitute for an EAW or EIS required for qualifying projects. Project types eligible to use the AUAR process are limited to residential, commercial, warehousing, and light industrial development, and any associated infrastructure related to those development projects. So any type of project that falls outside of those type of project types would not be able to utilize the AUAR process as an alternative form of review. But projects of this type that do proceed to develop within the AUAR area would then be exempt from further environmental review, as the AUAR would suffice as an alternative form of environmental review for those projects. Now, an AUAR must also be updated at least every 5 years, or potentially earlier if certain conditions in rule are met regarding the development within the defined area over that 5-year time period. So with that, I just wanted to quickly highlight some additional resources that EQB provides for those that are seeking guidance or have questions regarding environmental review. So one of EQB staff's main roles in environmental review is to provide technical assistance to all participants within the program. Over the years, EQB has developed a number of guidance documents to assist in implementing the program and providing rule interpretation assistance. EQB staff are currently working to update a number of our guidance documents. Now, for the most part, so far, this has been a bit of just a modernization of the existing guidance. The information provided in the existing guidance documents are still providing great guidance. However, some do have outdated pieces amongst them and provide information like CD-ROMs may be helpful in sending documents. So there is a clear need to remove some of that outdated information. In addition to that modernization, we are transitioning away from PDF documents, so it'll make it easier. It'll make things easier in the future for staff to update rather than having to create a new PDF and hope that everyone deletes them from their desktop. There are some new guidance pieces that will be coming, however, including guidance on how to use the soon to be available climate calculator tool, some updated petition guidance, and some new guidance on AUARs. Now, specifically for the AUAR guidance, there will likely be some engagement with local units of government. So if you are interested in participating in the future, please reach out to staff and we can help you connect with Sarah, who will be leading that task. We will also likely be developing or working on a development of guidance to assist in coordinating with tribal governments in environmental review. Now, in addition to our guidance pieces available on the EQB website, we now have what we are calling our environmental review data website. The website consolidates access to our active projects map, the environmental review database, as well as now displaying an interactive dashboard, which provides information about certain pieces of data that environmental review staff collect on ongoing environmental review projects in a given year. And of course, we have the EQB Monitor, which you can sign up for if you haven't already done via the link on this slide. The EQB Monitor is a weekly email publication that fulfills the regulatory notification requirements for all active environmental review projects. It lets people know when public comment periods begin, provides information about public meetings, and informs people about final decisions on environmental review documents. The monitor now also provides links to the environmental review database. So all environmental review documents for projects can be accessed and downloaded if needed. And that database can serve going forward as a library to reference past projects if needed. And with that, we've reached the end of the ER 101 presentation, and we will end the recording. I did put our information at the bottom of the slide, so if you do have questions or you'd like to talk to staff about any environmental review related issues, you can reach out to us at any time. Also, our website is stated there below if you'd like to go visit the data website or see any of the updated guidance.